The sanctuary doors swung open with a creak that silenced 300 wedding guests. I stood there in the entrance, wearing the same black dress I'd been planning to be buried in, watching my sister Jessica freeze at the altar in her pristine white gown. My parents turned from the front pew, their faces draining of color as if they'd seen a ghost, which in their minds, they had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 months earlier, they'd chosen her wedding over my funeral. Same day, same time, same church. They'd made their choice clear when I needed them most. Now it was time to show them the consequences of abandoning their own daughter when she was supposedly dead. My name is Emily Carter, and until March 15th of this year, I thought I understood what family meant. I was 28, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment at Pine Ridge Complex in Millbrook, Oregon, working as a graphic designer at Blueprint Design Studio downtown. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I'd built it piece by piece after walking away from my family 2 years earlier, when they made it clear that my happiness mattered less than their reputation. The rift started over something that should have been simple. I'd been dating someone they disapproved of, someone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. When that relationship ended badly and caused some drama in our small town, my parents sided with appearances over their own daughter. They chose what the neighbors would think over what I was going through. My sister Jessica, always the golden child, had supported their decision completely. So I'd moved out, found my own place, and tried to build a life separate from the Carter family name that meant so much to everyone else in Millbrook. For 2 years we'd maintained an uneasy distance, holiday cards but no visits, brief, polite exchanges when we ran into each other at Mike's Diner or the grocery store. I told myself I was fine with it. I told myself I didn't need them. That illusion shattered on a rainy Friday evening in March when my car skidded off the Old Mill Bridge during a sudden storm. The Clearwater River was running high from spring melt, and my sedan plunged through the guardrail and down into the churning water below. I remember the weightless feeling as the car fell, the shocking cold as water rushed through the windows, and then nothing. I woke up 3 days later, in a hospital bed 70 miles away in the next county. A trucker named Bill Henderson had seen my car go over, pulled me unconscious from the wreckage, and rushed me to Riverside Memorial Hospital. I'd suffered a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a punctured lung. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. For the first week, I drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to speak clearly or remember my own name, let alone contact anyone. When I finally regained enough awareness to ask for a phone, I called my parents' house. No answer. I tried my sister. Straight to voicemail. I assumed they were busy with work, with life, with the 1,000 small things that fill up days in a small town. I left messages explaining what had happened, where I was, that I was alive, and needed them. The messages went unreturned. Dr. Helen Foster, the attending physician who'd been monitoring my recovery, noticed my growing distress as days passed without any family contact. She was a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and the sort of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of delivering both good news and bad. She sat beside my bed one afternoon, chart in hand, and asked gently if there was anyone else she could contact for me. That's when I learned the truth that would change everything. Dr. Foster had taken it upon herself to call the Millbrook Police Department to report that I was alive and recovering. The desk sergeant she spoke to seemed confused by her call. According to him, the Carter family had already been notified of my death. A body had been recovered from the river. Funeral arrangements were being made. The room spun around me as Dr. Foster explained what she'd discovered. My car had been found in the river, but no body had been recovered at the scene. The current was strong, and search efforts had been called off after 2 days when nothing turned up. Somehow, in the chaos of miscommunication between different county jurisdictions and the assumption that no one could have survived such a crash, my parents had been told I was presumed dead. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. When Dr. Foster tried to clarify the situation with the Millbrook authorities, she was told that my family had specifically requested no further searches. They'd accepted the presumption of death and were proceeding with funeral arrangements. They hadn't tried to confirm, they hadn't demanded to see a body, they hadn't fought for answers or held on to hope. They'd simply accepted that I was gone and moved on. As I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to the steady beep of monitors, something fundamental shifted inside me. The family I'd been hoping to reconcile with someday, the parents whose approval I'd spent my whole life seeking, had written me off without a fight. When faced with losing their daughter, they'd chosen the easy path of assumption over the difficult work of certainty. Dr. Foster helped me piece together what had happened next. My parents had contacted Jessica immediately with the news. Instead of postponing her wedding, which had been planned for months and scheduled for March 20th, 5 days after my accident, they'd made a decision that revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. They'd scheduled my funeral for the morning of March 20th. Jessica's wedding would proceed as planned that same afternoon at St. Andrew's Methodist Church, the same church where they intended to hold my memorial service just hours earlier. Same building, same day, different events. One to mourn their dead daughter, another to celebrate their living one. The local newspaper had run a small notice about the tragic accident and upcoming memorial service, right alongside an announcement about Jessica's upcoming nuptials. In the tight-knit community of Millbrook, people were already talking about the bittersweet irony of death and new beginnings occurring on the same day in the same family. My parents had solved their scheduling conflict in the most revealing way possible. They'd chosen celebration over grief, future over past, the living daughter over the dead one. And they'd done it all without ever confirming that I was actually gone. During my second week in the hospital, I started making phone calls, not to my family, but to the few friends I still had in Millbrook, who might give me honest information about what was happening at home. Rachel Martinez, my former coworker at Blueprint Design, was shocked to hear my voice. She'd attended my memorial service, she said, voice shaking. My parents had spoken beautifully about my childhood, about the hopes they'd had for my future. Jessica had read a poem about sisterly love and loss. Then, Rachel told me, just 3 hours later, she'd watched Jessica walk down the aisle of the same church where my empty casket.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Had sat that morning. The same flowers that had decorated my memorial service had been rearranged for the wedding reception. The same guests who'd offered condolences in the morning had thrown rice and cheered in the afternoon. It was efficient, Rachel said, her voice hollow with disbelief. Economical. Like they'd found a way to handle both family obligations in a single day and check them off their list. That night, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I wasn't going to call them, I wasn't going to send a message or have Dr. Foster reach out on my behalf. I wasn't going to give them the chance to explain or apologize or claim they'd acted out of grief and confusion. Instead, I was going to let them live with their choice. I was going to recover in silence, rebuild my strength, and plan my return to Millbrook carefully. When I walked back into their lives, it would be at a moment and place of my choosing, in a way that would make the consequences of their abandonment impossible to ignore. I spent the next 6 weeks in recovery, first at the hospital, and then at a small rehabilitation facility in the next county. Physical therapy helped heal my body, but the emotional work of processing what my family had done took longer. I replayed every interaction we'd had over the past 2 years, looking for signs I'd missed, warning signals that should have told me exactly how little I meant to them when push came to shove. The truth was, I'd always known I was the second choice in my family. Jessica was younger, prettier, more compliant. She'd never questioned my parents' expectations or challenged their view of how life should be lived. She'd dated the right boys, chosen the right career path, made the right friends. When I'd stepped outside those lines, they'd made their disappointment clear. But I'd never imagined they'd choose a wedding over a funeral. I'd never thought they valued appearances so much that they'd bury their grief for one daughter to celebrate the joy of another on the same day. The efficiency of it was what haunted me most, the practical, economical way they'd handled the inconvenience of my death. During those weeks of recovery, I had plenty of time to plan. Jessica's original wedding had gone off without a hitch, from what I could learn, through careful social media stalking and discreet inquiries through Rachel. But I discovered something interesting as I dug deeper into their lives. The guilt had apparently gotten to them. Jessica had announced just weeks after her honeymoon that she wanted to renew her vows, a do-over, she called it, claiming the original ceremony had felt rushed and clouded by grief over losing her sister. They were planning a second wedding for May 15th, 2 months after the original. A chance to celebrate properly, she said in her Instagram posts, without the shadow of tragedy hanging over the day. Of course, what she really meant was that she wanted a wedding day that was entirely hers, not one shared with her dead sister's memorial service. She wanted celebration without the inconvenient reminder of loss. She wanted the attention and joy she felt she'd been denied the first time around. Perfect, that gave me exactly what I needed. A second chance to make a first impression. By early May, I was physically recovered and ready to return to Millbrook. I'd been careful to stay out of sight, avoiding any places where I might run into people who knew me. I'd grown my hair longer, lost weight during my recovery, and generally looked different enough that a casual observer might not immediately recognize me, but my family would know me instantly. I spent weeks planning exactly how I wanted to handle my return. Part of me wanted to simply show up at their door, let them deal with the shock privately, and try to rebuild from there. But the larger part of me, the part that had been abandoned when I needed them most, wanted them to experience their choice publicly. I wanted the community that had attended both my funeral and Jessica's wedding to witness the moment when the consequences of their decision became clear. The second wedding was being held at St. Andrew's Methodist Church on a Saturday afternoon in mid-May. The guest list was smaller than the original ceremony, mostly close family and friends who wanted to share in what Jessica was calling a more intimate celebration of love. The local paper had run another small announcement, noting that this ceremony would be a celebration of life and love as the Carter family moves forward from recent tragedy. I bought a black dress for the occasion, simple, elegant, appropriate for a funeral, but striking enough to command attention. I had my hair done at a salon in the next county, styled in a way that framed my face clearly. I wanted to look unmistakably myself, unmistakably present. The night before Jessica's second wedding, I drove back to Millbrook for the first time since my accident. The town looked exactly the same tree-lined streets, same small businesses, same sense of everyone knowing everyone else's business. I parked across from St. Andrew's Methodist Church and sat in my car, looking at the building where my parents had mourned my death in the morning and celebrated my sister's marriage in the afternoon. Tomorrow, it would be the site of their reckoning. I woke up on May 15th with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I dressed carefully, checked my appearance in the mirror, and drove to the church. The parking lot was filling up with familiar cars. I recognized my father's pickup truck, my mother's sedan, the vehicles of neighbors and family friends who'd been part of my life for years. I waited until the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I wanted everyone seated, everyone focused on the altar, everyone settled into the comfortable rhythm of a celebration. I wanted the music playing and the processional underway. I wanted my sister in her dress, my parents in their seats, and the pastor ready to perform the service. Then I wanted to walk through those doors and show them all what it looks like when someone returns from the dead. As I approached the church entrance, I could hear the organ music beginning inside. The same songs that had probably played at my memorial service were now setting the mood for Jessica's vow renewal. Through the glass doors, I could see the backs of heads I recognized, people turning to watch for the bride's entrance. Instead, they were about to get me. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and reached for the heavy wooden doors of St. Andrew's Methodist Church. It was time for the Carter family to learn that some choices can't be undone, some words can't be taken back, and some abandonment leaves scars that last forever. It was time for them to see what they'd thrown away when they chose convenience over love, appearance over truth, celebration over grief. It was time for them to understand that when you write someone off as dead, you'd better be certain they're not coming back to prove you wrong. The sanctuary doors swung open, and I stepped inside to reclaim my life. The silence that followed my entrance stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every face in the sanctuary had turned toward me, 300 guests frozen in various stages of shock, confusion, and dawning recognition. Some knew me immediately, despite the weight loss and longer hair, others squinted, trying to place the familiar features in an impossible context. The organist's fingers faltered on the keys, creating a discordant note that hung in the air like a question mark. My father, Robert Carter, stood slowly from the front pew, his weathered construction worker's hands gripping the wooden back so tightly his knuckles went white. At 58, he'd always been a man of few words and decisive action, but now he seemed paralyzed by indecision. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. Beside him, my mother Linda pressed one manicured hand to her chest, her real estate agent's composure cracking for the first time in years. But it was Jessica who commanded my attention. My 26-year-old sister stood frozen at the altar, in a different wedding dress than she'd worn 2 months ago, this one more elaborate, with intricate beadwork that caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her bouquet of white roses trembled in her grip, as she stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between terror and guilt, that transformed her usually perfect features into something almost unrecognizable. The groom, David Chen, her software engineer husband of 2 months, looked completely bewildered. He glanced between Jessica and me, clearly trying to process what was happening. David had never been particularly close to me, but he'd attended my memorial service out of respect for his new family. Now he was seeing a ghost made flesh, and the confusion on his face was almost comical. Father Timothy Brooks, the pastor who'd presided over both my funeral and Jessica's first wedding, recovered his composure first. The 52-year-old minister had served St. Andrew's for nearly a decade, and he'd seen enough family drama to recognize a crisis when it walked through his doors. He stepped forward from the altar, his voice carefully modulated in the tone he used for pastoral counseling sessions. "Emily," he said, my name carrying across the silent sanctuary like a prayer. "We're so grateful to see you safe and well. Perhaps we should move this conversation to my office, where we can talk privately." I remained in the doorway, making no move to enter further, or to retreat. I wanted every person in that church to witness this moment, to see the Carter family's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. These were the same people who'd attended my memorial service, who'd offered condolences to my parents, who'd watched Jessica walk down the same aisle just hours after mourning my death. "I don't think privacy is what this moment calls for," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the acoustics, designed to project every word of Sunday sermons to the back pews. After all, my death was apparently public enough to warrant newspaper announcements and community mourning. "I think my resurrection deserves the same audience." A murmur rippled through the congregation, guests turning to whisper to their neighbors, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. I recognized many faces from my childhood, family, friends, and neighbors who'd watched me grow up, who'd known me as the Carter girl, who'd always been a little too independent, a little too willing to challenge expectations. Mrs. Henderson from down the street clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide behind wire-rimmed glasses. The Washingtons, our former next-door neighbors, sat with their mouths agape. Tom Bradley, who'd gone to high school with me, pulled out his phone before thinking better of it, and putting it away. This wasn't the kind of moment you filmed, even in an age where everything became content. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Emily, sweetheart, we thought you were dead. Your car, the river, they told us. Her words trailed off as she seemed to realize how hollow they sounded in the face of my physical presence. They told you what, exactly? I asked, taking a single step into the sanctuary but remaining near the doors. That my body was never recovered, that the search had been called off? That maybe, just maybe, your daughter might still be alive somewhere, hurt and alone, and waiting for her family to come find her. My father's face flushed red, the color climbing from his collar to his receding hairline. Robert Carter had built his construction business on reliability and follow-through, qualities that had made him respected in Millbrook's business community. But when it came to following through, on searching for his supposedly dead daughter, he'd apparently found his standards more flexible. The police said the current was too strong, he said, his voice defensive. They said no one could have survived that crash. We had to accept that you were gone, and try to move forward. Move forward, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Is that what you call scheduling my funeral for the same morning as Jessica's wedding? Moving forward by turning my death into a scheduling convenience. The collective intake of breath from the congregation was audible. Many of these people had attended both events, but hearing it stated so baldly made the callousness of the decision impossible to ignore. I watched faces in the crowd as the full implications sank in. These were people who valued family loyalty above almost everything else, who would have moved heaven and earth to avoid such a conflict if it had been their own family. Jessica finally found her voice, though it shook with emotion. Emily, you don't understand, we were grieving. We were trying to honor you, while also not letting my wedding be completely overshadowed by tragedy. We thought you would have wanted us to celebrate love, even in the midst of loss. The rationalization was so perfectly Jessica, so carefully crafted to make their abandonment sound like nobility. She'd always been gifted at reframing her selfishness as sacrifice, her convenience as consideration for others. But this time, the audience could see through the performance. Honor me, I laughed, the sound harsh in the sacred space. You honored me by ensuring I wouldn't interfere with your special day. You honored me by making sure my death didn't require any real inconvenience on your part. Same venue, same day, just different time slots, very efficient, very practical, very Carter family. The hurt in my parents' eyes was real, but so was the hurt I'd carried for 2 months, while recovering alone in a hospital 70 miles away. They'd chosen to believe I was dead, rather than fight for the possibility that I might be alive. They'd chosen convenience over hope, celebration over investigation, their living daughter's happiness over their dead daughter's dignity. David stepped forward, clearly out of his depth, but trying to support his wife. Emily, I know this is difficult, but Jessica was devastated by your death. We all were. The decision to continue with the wedding wasn't made lightly. Your parents felt that canceling would dishonor both you and the months of planning that had gone into the celebration. David, I said, turning my attention to him directly for the first time. How long did you date Jessica before proposing? He looked confused by the question. 3 years, why does that matter? 3 years, I nodded, and in those 3 years, how many times did you meet me? How many conversations did we have? How many family dinners included me? David's silence was answer enough. During his entire courtship of Jessica, I'd been persona non grata in the Carter household. He knew me only as the estranged daughter who'd caused problems and then disappeared from family gatherings. My death had been tragic in the abstract, but it hadn't disrupted any real relationship he'd had with me. That's what I thought, I continued. So your perspective on what would honor me is based on knowing me as the inconvenient family member who was already written off long before that car went into the river. You have no idea what would honor me because you never bothered to know me at all. The truth of that statement hit harder than I'd expected. David wasn't malicious, just ignorant. He'd married into a family narrative where I was the problem child who'd rejected their values and created unnecessary drama. My death had fit neatly into that story, as the tragic, but perhaps inevitable conclusion to a life lived outside their approval. Father Brooks tried again to redirect the situation. Emily, I think we're all struggling to process this miracle of your survival. Perhaps if we moved to a more private setting, we could work through these understandable emotions and find a path toward healing and forgiveness. Forgiveness, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. That's an interesting concept, Father Brooks. Tell me, when you presided over my memorial service, what did you say about forgiveness? About my parents' love for their daughter, about the tragedy of a young life cut short. The pastor's discomfort was visible. He delivered what he thought was a genuine eulogy, speaking about the complexities of family relationships and the hope that love transcends death. Now those words felt hollow, given that the family had been so quick to accept death and move on to celebration. I spoke about your parents' love for you, about their grief at losing you so young, he said carefully. I spoke about the mystery of God's plan and the hope that families separated by death would be reunited in heaven. And then 3 hours later, you married my sister in the same church where my empty casket had sat that morning, I said, using the same flowers, serving some of the same guests, creating a day that honored both death and new life with remarkable efficiency. The brutal efficiency of it was what had haunted me most during my recovery. Not just the decision to proceed with the wedding, but the way they'd managed to honor both obligations without really honoring either. My memorial service had been abbreviated to make room for wedding preparations. Jessica's celebration had been shadowed by the morning's grief. Neither event had received the full attention it deserved because they'd been crammed into a single day for convenience. My mother stood up, her real estate training kicking in, as she tried to manage this crisis like a difficult negotiation. Linda Carter had spent years helping families navigate major life transitions, and she approached emotional conflicts like problems to be solved through compromise and creative solutions. Emily, honey, you have to understand the impossible position we were in, she said, her professional calm wavering only slightly. We were planning a funeral for one daughter while trying to support another daughter on what should have been the happiest day of her life. We thought we were doing the best we could under terrible circumstances. The best you could do, I said slowly, was assume I was dead, without demanding proof. The best you could do was schedule around my death, instead of fighting against it. The best you could do was make sure my tragedy didn't interfere with Jessica's happiness. I could see the words hitting home as my mother's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, smearing the makeup she'd carefully applied for her younger daughter's second wedding, but they were tears of guilt and self-recognition, not just grief at seeing me alive. The congregation was beginning to murmur more audibly now, processing what they were witnessing. These weren't just family tensions or wedding drama, this was a fundamental breakdown of the values that held their community together. The Carter family had been respected members of Millbrook society, known for their work ethic, their church attendance, their contribution to local causes. But respect in a small town depends on living up to certain unspoken standards, and abandoning a daughter, even a supposedly dead one, violated those standards in ways that couldn't be easily forgiven. I could see the shift happening in real time as neighbors and family friends re-evaluated everything they thought they knew about the people sitting in the front pews. The Carters' reputation, built over decades of community involvement, was crumbling with each word I spoke. Jessica was crying now too, but her tears seemed more focused on what this meant for her wedding than on any genuine remorse for my abandonment. Her second chance at a perfect wedding day was evaporating before her eyes, just as her first wedding had been overshadowed by my supposed death. She was finally experiencing the kind of inconvenience she'd managed to avoid 2 months earlier. Emily, please, she said, her voice breaking. I know this looks terrible, but we really did grieve for you, we really did miss you. The decision to go ahead with the wedding was agonizing, but we felt like canceling wouldn't bring you back and would just waste all the planning and deposits and everyone's travel arrangements. The practical concerns she listed were so perfectly revealing. Travel arrangements, deposits, planning. These were the factors that had weighed against the possibility that their daughter and sister might still be alive somewhere, hurt, and waiting for rescue. Financial and logistical considerations had outweighed hope. Jessica, I said, my voice softer but no less cutting, do you know what I was doing while you were walking down the aisle in this church 2 months ago? She shook her head, mascara creating dark tracks down her cheeks. I was learning to breathe on my own again after having a punctured lung. I was trying to remember my own name after a severe concussion. I was asking nurses if anyone had called looking for me, if my family was worried, if anyone was trying to find me. I paused, letting that image sink in. While you were cutting your wedding cake, I was eating hospital pudding through a straw because my jaw was too swollen to chew solid food. The specific details made it real in a way that abstract concepts of abandonment couldn't. Every person in that church could picture a young woman alone in a hospital bed, and they could picture a wedding reception celebrating just hours after her supposed funeral. The contrast was stark and damning. My father finally moved from his position behind the pew, walking slowly down the aisle toward me. His construction boots echoed in the silent sanctuary, each step deliberate and heavy. When he was close enough to speak without the entire congregation hearing every word, he stopped and looked directly into my eyes for the first time since I'd walked through those doors. Emily, he said, his voice thick with emotion, we failed you. I don't know how to make that right, but we failed you when you needed us most. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I'm sorrier than I've ever been about anything in my life. It was the closest thing to accountability I'd heard from any of them, but it wasn't enough. Sorry didn't erase 2 months of abandonment. Sorry didn't undo the choice to schedule my funeral around Jessica's convenience. Sorry didn't address the fundamental selfishness that had led them to choose the easy path of acceptance over the difficult work of hope. Dad, I said, and I saw him flinch at the childhood name I hadn't used in years. Being sorry doesn't change what you chose. When faced with losing me, you chose to let me go without a fight. When faced with disrupting Jessica's wedding, you chose to bury me in the morning and celebrate her in the afternoon. Those choices tell me everything I need to know about where I stand in this family. The words hung between us like a wall neither of us knew how to breach. Behind him, I could see my mother and Jessica watching our exchange, waiting to see if he could somehow repair what felt irreparably broken. But some breaks don't heal, no matter how much sorry gets poured into them. Some abandonment leaves scars that remain tender forever, reminders of the moment when love proved conditional and family proved fragile. I had walked into this church to show them the consequences of their choices. Now I needed to decide what came next. How to rebuild a life that had been declared dead by the people who should have fought hardest to keep it alive. The wedding was ruined, the family was exposed, and the community had witnessed the Carter family's fall from grace. The question now was whether any of us could find a way forward from this moment of reckoning, or whether some betrayals create distance that can never be crossed again. I had their attention now, their remorse, their guilt. But I wasn't sure any of that was enough to rebuild what they had so easily thrown away when they thought I couldn't return to hold them accountable. The sanctuary remained silent, except for the soft sounds of weeping from various pews, as 300 wedding guests waited to see what would happen next in a drama that had moved far beyond anything they'd expected when they dressed up for a celebration that afternoon. I stood there in my black dress in the doorway of St. Andrew's Methodist Church, no longer the dead daughter they'd mourned in the morning and forgotten by evening. I was something else now, something they hadn't planned for and didn't know how to handle. I was the consequence of their choices, returned to life and demanding an accounting they weren't prepared to give. Time moved differently in moments like these, each second stretching to accommodate the weight of words that couldn't be unsaid and choices that couldn't be undone. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to highlight the dust motes floating in the air between us, tiny particles suspended in space just as we were all suspended in this moment of revelation and reckoning. Father Brooks cleared his throat, drawing attention back to his role as mediator in what had become less wedding and more intervention. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should postpone today's ceremony and give everyone time to process this reunion. Emily's return is a blessing that deserves our full attention and gratitude." "No," Jessica said sharply, surprising everyone including herself with the vehemence in her voice. "No, I'm not postponing another wedding because of Emily's timing. She's alive, that's wonderful, that's a miracle. But she chose to come here today, to this moment, for maximum drama and impact. She could have called, could have come to the house, could have handled this privately. She chose to make this public, to ruin my wedding just like her death overshadowed my first one." The honesty was brutal and revealing. Jessica had finally said what everyone was thinking but no one had dared voice. My return wasn't just inconveniently timed, it was deliberately calculated to cause maximum disruption, and she was right. I had chosen this moment, this audience, this maximum impact approach to my resurrection. But her complaint missed the fundamental point. I hadn't chosen the timing of my accident or my family's response to it. I hadn't chosen to be abandoned in a hospital while they moved on with their lives. I had simply chosen when and how to reveal the consequences of their abandonment. "You're absolutely right, Jessica," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I chose this moment because I wanted everyone who attended my funeral and your wedding on the same day to see what that choice actually meant. I wanted the people who watched you walk down this aisle 3 hours after mourning my death to understand exactly what kind of family makes that decision." The congregation was fully engaged now, no longer just witnesses but participants in this community reckoning. Small towns run on reputation and shared values, and the Carter family was being evaluated in real time against standards they'd previously been thought to exemplify. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught Sunday school for 40 years, stood up in her pew. At 73, she commanded respect through sheer longevity and moral authority. When she spoke, people listened. "I attended Emily's memorial service," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of moral guidance. "I watched this family mourn their daughter with what appeared to be genuine grief. I also attended Jessica's wedding 3 hours later and watched this same family celebrate with what appeared to be genuine joy. At the time, I admired their resilience, their ability to honor both sorrow and happiness in a single day." She paused, looking directly at my parents. "Now I understand I was witnessing something else entirely. I was watching a family that had given up on one daughter without a fight in order to celebrate another daughter without inconvenience. That's not resilience, that's abandonment dressed up as moving forward." The moral authority in her voice was devastating. Mrs. Patterson had taught most of the adults in this room when they were children. She'd presided over Sunday school lessons about the Good Shepherd who left 99 sheep to search for the one that was lost. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the Carter family had done exactly the opposite, abandoning the lost sheep to focus on the flock that remained. My mother's real estate instincts finally kicked in completely, the professional training that taught her to salvage difficult situations and find acceptable compromises for all parties. She stood up, addressing the congregation as much as me. "Emily, sweetheart, you're absolutely right to be angry with us. We made terrible decisions based on incomplete information and our own grief and confusion. But you're alive, and that's what matters now. We can work through this as a family. We can rebuild our relationships and learn from our mistakes." It was a perfect real estate agent response, acknowledging fault while immediately pivoting to solutions and future possibilities. But family relationships aren't property transactions, and some damage can't be repaired through negotiation and compromise. "Mom," I said, using the childhood name deliberately, "you keep talking about rebuilding and moving forward and learning from mistakes. But you haven't acknowledged what the mistake actually was. You haven't said that abandoning me without a fight was wrong. You haven't admitted that choosing Jessica's wedding over the possibility of my survival was a betrayal that can't be fixed with better communication and family counseling. She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could launch into another professional crisis management speech. You haven't even asked how I survived, where I've been for 2 months, what it was like to recover alone while my family buried me and moved on. You're so focused on managing this situation that you haven't shown any genuine curiosity about my actual experience. The observation hit home because it was undeniably true. In the 20 minutes since I'd walked through those doors, not one member of my family had asked about my recovery, my injury, what I'd endured while they thought I was dead. They'd been entirely focused on explaining their own actions and managing the social consequences of my return. David, who'd been standing awkwardly beside Jessica throughout this confrontation, finally spoke up. Emily, you're right, we should have asked about your experience first. Are you okay? Were you badly hurt? How did you survive the crash? It was a small gesture, but it was the first question anyone had asked about my well-being, rather than my motivations. I almost smiled at the irony that the person least connected to me was the first to show basic human concern for what I'd endured. Thank you for asking, David, I said. I had 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a severe concussion. I spent 3 weeks in intensive care, and another 3 weeks in rehabilitation. A trucker named Bill Henderson pulled me from the river and saved my life. I've been living in a small apartment in the next county, working part-time when my health allows it, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that my family had already declared over. The specific details created another layer of uncomfortable reality. While they'd been moving on with weddings and normal life, I'd been fighting to relearn basic functions like walking steady and speaking clearly. While they'd been planning Jessica's second wedding, I'd been attending physical therapy sessions and slowly rebuilding my strength. Father Brooks made another attempt at pastoral intervention. Emily, your survival is truly miraculous, and your family's joy at seeing you alive is obvious despite the pain and confusion of this moment. Perhaps we could arrange some family counseling sessions to work through these complex emotions and find a path toward healing. Father, I said, what would you tell a parishioner whose family abandoned them when they needed help most? What biblical guidance would you offer someone whose parents chose convenience over hope, celebration over grief, moving forward over fighting for their child? The theological challenge was deliberate. Father Brooks had built his ministry on themes of redemption and forgiveness, but he'd also preached countless sermons about the sacred nature of family bonds and the obligation to care for the vulnerable. My situation forced him to choose between competing moral imperatives. I would tell them that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, not something we do for others, he said carefully. But I would also tell them that true repentance requires acknowledging the full weight of our actions and their consequences. Healing can't begin until accountability is complete. It was a diplomatic answer that avoided taking sides while acknowledging the complexity of the situation, but it also suggested that my family's expressions of sorrow so far had fallen short of true accountability. Jessica wiped her eyes and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the church. Emily, what do you want from us? You've made your point. Everyone can see that we made terrible decisions. You've ruined my wedding and humiliated our family in front of the entire community. What comes next? What will it take for you to forgive us and let us try to be a family again? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with desperation and accusation. She was asking for terms of surrender while simultaneously blaming me for the consequences of her own family's choices. It was so perfectly Jessica, taking responsibility while making it clear that the real problem was my reaction to their abandonment, not the abandonment itself. I looked around the sanctuary at the faces watching this drama unfold. These were people I'd grown up with, neighbors who'd known me since childhood, community members who'd formed opinions about the Carter family based on decades of observation. They were witnessing something that would be talked about in Millbrook for years, a moment that would redefine how this family was perceived and remembered. Some of them looked sympathetic to my position, understanding that my dramatic return was justified by the dramatic nature of my abandonment. Others seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of this confrontation, preferring that family business be handled privately regardless of the circumstances. A few appeared to be enjoying the spectacle, the rare opportunity to witness the fall of a family that had seemed to have everything together. But all of them were waiting for my answer to Jessica's question: what did I want? What would it take? What were my terms for rejoining a family that had declared me dead and moved on without me? The truth was, I didn't know. I'd planned this moment of revelation carefully, but I hadn't planned what came after. I'd wanted them to face the consequences of their choices, to feel the weight of their abandonment, to understand what they'd thrown away. But I hadn't decided whether any of that was enough to rebuild what they'd so easily discarded. Standing there in the doorway of St. Andrew's Methodist Church, still wearing the black dress I'd chosen for my symbolic resurrection, I realized that revenge was easier than reconciliation. Exposing their betrayal was simpler than deciding whether to forgive it. Making them feel guilty was more straightforward than figuring out how to trust them again. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 2 months of separation, years of estrangement, and a lifetime of being the daughter who never quite fit the Carter family mold. 300 wedding guests waited for resolution to a story that had no easy ending, no clean conclusion that would allow everyone to go home feeling satisfied with the outcome. I had walked into this church to show them what they'd lost when they chose to let me go without a fight. Now I had to decide whether what remained of our family was worth the fight to rebuild it, or whether some bridges, once burned, could never be crossed again. The weight of Jessica's question settled over the sanctuary like dust after an explosion. What did I want from them? The answer should have been simple, but standing there surrounded by the ruins of what had once been my family's reputation, I realized I hadn't thought beyond this moment of exposure. I'd spent weeks planning my dramatic return, choreographing this public reckoning, but I hadn't considered what victory would actually look like. My silence stretched long enough that some of the wedding guests began shifting uncomfortably in their pews. A few whispered conversations started and stopped as people realized their voices carried too clearly in the acoustics designed for prayer and proclamation. The afternoon sun had moved during our confrontation, changing the angle of light through the stained glass windows, casting different patterns of color across the walls that had witnessed countless family celebrations and now this family's destruction. Father Brooks stepped forward again, his pastoral instincts struggling against the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Emily," he said gently, "perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting. I'm sure everyone here understands that family reconciliation is a process that takes time and careful consideration, but I wasn't ready to retreat into privacy, to let my family manage this crisis away from the community that had witnessed their choices." These people had attended my memorial service, where they'd heard beautiful words about parental love and family bonds. They'd watched my parents accept condolences with apparent grace and dignity. They deserved to see the reality behind that performance. "Father Brooks," I said, "when you presided over my memorial service, what did my parents tell you about our relationship, about why I hadn't been part of family gatherings for the past 2 years? About the circumstances that led to our estrangement?" The pastor's discomfort was visible as he navigated between pastoral confidentiality and the public nature of our confrontation. They spoke about the complexities of family relationships, about loving someone even when you disagree with their choices. They expressed regret about unresolved conflicts and the tragedy of losing the opportunity for reconciliation. "Regret about unresolved conflicts," I repeated. "That's an interesting way to describe writing your daughter off because she dated someone they disapproved of and refused to apologize for living her own life." The congregation's attention sharpened. Until now, many of them had known about some tension between me and my family, but few understood the specifics. Small towns thrive on gossip, but the Carter family had been skilled at maintaining their privacy while allowing rumors to fill in the gaps with assumptions that generally favored their version of events. My mother stood up again, her real estate training finally failing her as raw emotion took over. Emily, that's not fair. We didn't write you off, we were trying to protect you from making mistakes that would hurt you in the long run. We were concerned about the people you were associating with, the choices you were making. Protect me, I said, the words bitter in my mouth. Is that what you call refusing to speak to me for 6 months after my relationship ended? Is that what you call telling me I wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner unless I apologized for embarrassing the family? Is that what you call making it clear that my presence at family events was conditional on my compliance with your expectations? The specifics were damaging because they revealed the systematic nature of my exclusion. This hadn't been a single fight or momentary conflict. It had been a sustained campaign to force me to choose between my independence and my family, with the assumption that I would eventually surrender and conform to their standards. Mrs. Patterson, still standing in her pew like a moral sentinel, shook her head slowly. Robert, Linda, she said, addressing my parents directly, I've known your family for 20 years. I've watched Emily grow up in this church, seen her struggle to find her place in a world that often demands conformity from young women. What you're describing isn't protection, it's conditional love. The rebuke from someone of Mrs. Patterson's standing in the community carried weight that went beyond personal opinion. She represented the moral authority of their generation, the values that my parents claimed to uphold. Her judgment mattered in ways that went beyond this moment, affecting how they would be perceived and treated in Millbrook for years to come. My father finally moved from behind the pew, where he'd been standing like a defendant awaiting verdict. His construction boots echoed on the wooden floor as he walked closer to me, his face showing the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying guilt too heavy for one person to bear. Emily, he said, his voice rougher than usual, we were wrong. About the conditions we put on loving you, about the way we handled your relationship, about giving up on you when the car went in the river. We were wrong about all of it, and I don't know how to fix what we broke. It was the first real admission of guilt I'd heard from any of them, without qualifications or explanations or attempts to justify their actions, but it came too late and cost too little. Admitting wrongdoing in front of a church full of people felt more like damage control than genuine repentance. Dad, I said, and again I saw him flinch at the childhood name that carried so much history between us. Being wrong and being sorry aren't the same thing as making amends. You can't undo 2 years of conditional love and 2 months of abandonment with an admission of guilt in front of people you're worried about impressing. Jessica finally stepped down from the altar where she'd been standing like an actress who'd forgotten her lines. Her wedding dress rustled against the steps as she moved toward us, her face streaked with makeup and tears, but her spine still straight with the kind of defiance that had always defined her approach to conflict. Emily, I need you to stop, she said, her voice carrying a note of command that reminded me of our childhood dynamics. I need you to stop punishing all of us for decisions made during the worst week of our lives. Yes, we handled everything badly, yes, we made mistakes. But you're not innocent in this either. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. After everything that had been revealed, Jessica was still trying to shift blame back to me, to make my reaction to their abandonment somehow equivalent to their abandonment itself. Explain that, I said simply. You disappeared from our lives 2 years ago because we didn't approve of your choices, she said, her confidence building as she found her footing in familiar territory. You cut yourself off from family events, stopped returning phone calls, made it clear you didn't want or need us. So when the police told us you were dead, we didn't have recent conversations to remember, recent moments of connection to grieve. You'd already made yourself a stranger to us. It was a sophisticated manipulation, the kind Jessica had always excelled at. She was reframing my response to their conditional love as the cause of their conditional mourning. If I'd already distanced myself from the family, their failure to fight for my life became understandable, even justified. The congregation was listening intently, many of them nodding slightly as Jessica's logic took hold. Small-town values included family loyalty and respect for parental authority. My independence had always been viewed with some suspicion by people who valued conformity and tradition above individual autonomy. So my crime, I said slowly, was refusing to apologize for living my own life, and the appropriate punishment for that crime was being abandoned when I needed you most. Is that the family value system you want this community to endorse? David stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, but apparently feeling obligated to support his wife. Emily, I think what Jessica is trying to say is that relationships require effort from both sides. If you'd maintained closer contact with the family, if there had been more recent communication, maybe the response to your accident would have been different. David, I said, turning my full attention to him, let me ask you something. If Jessica disappeared tomorrow, if her car went off a bridge and her body wasn't recovered, how long would you search for her? How much proof would you require before accepting that she was dead? The question was unfair but illuminating. David's love for Jessica was new and passionate, uncomplicated by years of conflict and disappointed expectations. He would move heaven and earth to find her, would never accept her death without absolute proof, would fight anyone who suggested he should stop searching and move on with his life. That's different, he said weakly. Jessica and I don't have unresolved conflicts or complicated history. Exactly, I said. Your love for her is unconditional. You would search for her because losing her would be unacceptable, not because she'd earned the right to be rescued through good behavior. That's what parental love is supposed to look like. That's what family is supposed to mean. The comparison was devastating because it highlighted the conditional nature of my family's affection. They would have fought harder for a stranger than they'd fought for their own daughter because a stranger wouldn't have come with baggage and disappointment and wounded pride. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from down the street, stood up slowly, using her husband's arm for support. At 81, she'd buried 2 children, and knew something about the desperation that drives parents to search for missing family members. I buried my son Tommy 30 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite her age. Car accident, just like Emily's supposed to be, but we demanded to see his body, we insisted on dental records for identification, we wouldn't let them close the case until we had absolute proof that our boy was gone. She paused, looking directly at my parents, because that's what you do when you love someone. You don't accept their death as a convenience, you fight it like the enemy it is. The testimony from someone who'd actually lived through similar circumstances was more powerful than any argument I could have made. Mrs. Henderson's experience gave weight to the accusation that my parents had given up too easily, had chosen acceptance over hope, because acceptance was easier to manage. My mother finally broke, the professional composure that had carried her through decades of difficult real estate negotiations crumbling completely under the weight of community judgment and her own guilt. She sank back into the pew, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. We were tired, she said, through her tears. We were so tired of fighting with you, of worrying about you, of trying to fix a relationship that seemed broken beyond repair. When they told us you were dead, it felt like the fighting could finally stop. I know how horrible that sounds, but we were exhausted from loving someone who didn't seem to want our love. It was the most honest thing any of them had said, and it was also the most damaging. She'd admitted that my death had felt like relief, like the end of a burden they'd grown tired of carrying. The exhaustion was real, but exhaustion didn't justify abandonment. Being tired of conflict didn't excuse giving up on your child's life. The congregation absorbed this admission in silence, many of them looking uncomfortable with the raw honesty of it. Parental love was supposed to be infinite and unconditional, not something that could be worn down by conflict and disappointment. My mother had revealed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about family bonds. Father Brooks finally found his voice again, though it carried less authority than before. Linda, grief and stress can make us say things we don't mean, can make us feel things that seem wrong in retrospect. Perhaps what you're describing is the natural human response to prolonged conflict, not a reflection of your true feelings for Emily. But my mother shook her head, still crying but determined to finish what she'd started. No, father, I need to be honest about this. We were relieved when the fighting stopped, even if it stopped because we thought she was dead. That relief lasted exactly until we saw her walk through those doors today. Now I understand what we really lost when we gave up on her. The honesty was brutal and necessary. My mother had finally acknowledged what I'd suspected but never been able to prove, that my estrangement from the family had been as much a relief to them as it had been painful. They'd gotten tired of having a daughter who didn't fit their expectations, and my supposed death had solved that problem for them. Jessica looked stricken by her mother's admission, perhaps understanding for the first time how conditional her own position in the family might be. If they could grow tired of loving me, if they could find relief in my death, what did that mean for her own security as the favored daughter? "Mom," Jessica said, her voice small and uncertain, "you don't mean that, you can't mean that." "I do mean it," Linda said, wiping her eyes but meeting Jessica's gaze directly, "and that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. But Emily deserves to hear the truth about how we really felt, not just pretty words about grief and loss and loving her despite our disagreements." The truth was uglier than anything I'd imagined during my months of recovery and planning. I'd assumed they'd given up on me out of laziness or convenience or simple indifference. I hadn't considered that they might have found actual relief in believing I was dead, that my supposed death had solved the problem of having a daughter who refused to conform to their expectations. Tom Bradley, who'd gone to high school with me and now worked at the bank downtown, stood up near the back of the church. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd known me before the family conflicts began, "I remember you from high school. You were always fighting for the underdog, always standing up for kids who didn't fit in. You haven't changed, you're still fighting for someone who got written off too easily. It's just that this time you're fighting for yourself." The observation reframed my dramatic return in terms that resonated with my childhood personality and values. I had always been drawn to lost causes and forgotten people. Now I was applying those same instincts to my own situation, refusing to accept my family's decision to give up on me. "Tom's right," said Rachel Martinez, my former co-worker who'd been sitting quietly near the middle of the church. "Emily never accepted that some people were disposable, that some stories didn't deserve happy endings. She fought for clients who other designers would have given up on, worked extra hours to make impossible projects succeed. She wouldn't accept that I was too difficult when other employers had written me off." Rachel's testimony added another layer to the narrative, showing that my refusal to accept abandonment wasn't just personal grievance, but consistent with a lifetime pattern of fighting for people who'd been discarded by others. My family had become the bullies I'd always stood up against, and I was responding the only way I'd ever known how. The support from community members who remembered me before the family conflicts began was unexpected and moving. These people had watched me grow up, had seen the person I'd been before pride and disappointment had poisoned family relationships. Their testimony carried weight because it wasn't contaminated by the recent conflicts that had defined my interactions with my parents and sister.
Doctor.
Helen Foster had been sitting quietly in the back of the church, having driven from the next county when she'd heard about the wedding through hospital colleagues who had connections in Millbrook. She stood up now, her medical authority adding credibility to her words. "I treated Emily for 2 months," she said, her voice carrying the professional calm that had helped me through my darkest moments of recovery. "I watched her struggle to understand why her family never came looking for her, never called the hospitals, never demanded proof of death. I've seen a lot of family dynamics in my career, but I've never seen anyone fight so hard to believe their family loved them, despite evidence to the contrary." Dr. Foster's testimony added medical and professional weight to the emotional dynamics we'd been exploring. She'd witnessed my confusion and pain during recovery, had seen firsthand how the abandonment had affected my healing process. Emily spent weeks making excuses for your absence, she continued, looking directly at my parents. She convinced herself you were too grief-stricken to search, too overwhelmed by loss to think clearly. She protected your reputation even while she was recovering alone from injuries that could have killed her. Even now, after everything you've revealed about your feelings, she's shown more loyalty to this family than this family has shown to her. The doctor's words hit my parents like physical blows. They'd been so focused on defending their own actions and managing their own guilt that they hadn't considered how their abandonment had affected my recovery process. They hadn't thought about the additional trauma of healing alone while making excuses for their absence. My father looked older than his 58 years as he processed Dr. Foster's words. The weight of what they'd done was finally settling on him without the cushion of rationalization and self-justification that had protected him for the past 2 months. "Doctor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was she asking for us?" During her recovery, was Emily asking for her family? Dr. Foster nodded. Every day for the first month, she kept asking if anyone had called, if anyone was looking for her, if we could try calling her family again. When I finally told her that you'd been notified of her death and had accepted it without demanding proof, she stopped asking. She stopped hoping. That's when her real healing began, when she accepted that she was truly alone. The image of me lying in a hospital bed, asking daily if my family was looking for me, was more devastating than any argument I could have made about their abandonment. It showed the human cost of their decision to give up hope, the specific ways their choice had caused additional pain during my most vulnerable time. Jessica was crying again, but these tears seemed different from her earlier emotional displays. These looked like tears of genuine understanding rather than frustrated self-pity. "Emily," she said, her voice breaking, "I didn't know you were asking for us. I thought you were unconscious, that you wouldn't have known we weren't there." "I was conscious enough to hope," I said simply. "I was conscious enough to believe that somewhere, my family was fighting to find me, refusing to give up, demanding answers. I held on to that hope for weeks because I couldn't imagine that the people who raised me would just accept my death and move on." The sanctuary fell silent again as the full weight of what had transpired settled over everyone present. This wasn't just a story about family conflict or wedding drama, it was a reckoning with fundamental questions about love, loyalty, and the obligations that bind families together, even during the most difficult circumstances. I looked around the church at the faces watching this unfold, realizing that this moment had moved beyond personal grievance into something larger. My family's abandonment had violated community standards about family loyalty and parental responsibility. Their relief at my supposed death had challenged assumptions about unconditional love that formed the foundation of their social world. But exposing their failures wasn't the same as healing from them. Proving their guilt wasn't the same as finding a path forward. I had succeeded in showing them the consequences of their choices, but I still didn't know what came next, whether forgiveness was possible or desirable, whether our family could be rebuilt, or whether it should be. The afternoon sun continued its movement across the sky, changing the patterns of light and shadow in the sanctuary, marking time that couldn't be recovered and words that couldn't be unsaid. 300 wedding guests waited to see how this story would end, whether this family could find its way back to each other, or whether some betrayals create distances that can never be crossed. Standing there in my black dress in the church, where they'd mourned my death and celebrated my sister's new life, I realized that resurrection was more complicated than simply returning from the dead. Coming back to life meant deciding what kind of life was worth living, what kind of family was worth belonging to, and whether love could survive the kind of abandonment I'd experienced. The hard part wasn't proving they'd failed me, the hard part was deciding whether they deserved the chance to try again. The weight of Dr. Foster's words settled over the sanctuary like a shroud, each syllable adding to the crushing realization of what my family had cost me during my recovery. But as I stood there in that black dress, watching my parents grapple with the magnitude of their abandonment, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had sustained me through months of planning this confrontation was transforming into something else, something that felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. Foster, I said, turning to address the woman who had shown me more care during my recovery than my own family had in years. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for caring enough to make the drive and witness this conversation, but I think it's time for me to speak for myself now. The doctor nodded and settled back into her pew, her presence still lending weight to everything that had been revealed, but stepping back to let me control the narrative from here forward. The sanctuary remained hushed, 300 wedding guests holding their collective breath as they waited to see how this drama would resolve. I walked further into the church, no longer standing in the doorway like someone ready to flee. Each step on the worn wooden floors echoed with finality, bringing me closer to my family and deeper into a conversation that would define the rest of our relationships. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows had shifted again, casting rainbow patterns across the walls that seemed almost mocking in their beauty, as if the church itself was trying to offer hope in the midst of devastation. Jessica, I said, stopping about 10 feet from where she stood in her elaborate wedding dress, you asked me what I want from this family. You asked what it would take for me to forgive you and let us try to be a family again. I've been thinking about that question for the past hour, and I realize the problem isn't what I want. The problem is what you think forgiveness means. My sister's face was streaked with mascara and tears, her carefully styled hair beginning to come loose from its pins, but she straightened her shoulders in the gesture I remembered from childhood whenever she was preparing to defend herself against criticism. Tell me what you think I believe about forgiveness, she said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. You think forgiveness is something I owe you because you're sorry now, I said. You think it's a reset button that erases the consequences of your choices and lets everything go back to the way it was before. You think admitting you were wrong should be enough to restore the relationship without any fundamental changes in how you treat me or value me. Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. You want forgiveness that costs you nothing beyond the discomfort of this public confrontation. You want me to absolve you so you can stop feeling guilty about what you did, but that's not forgiveness, Jessica, that's just conflict resolution. I turned to address my parents as well, including them in the explanation that I'd been formulating during the long months of recovery. Real forgiveness requires genuine repentance, and genuine repentance requires understanding not just that you were wrong, but why you were wrong, and what you need to change to avoid being wrong in the same way again. My father stepped forward slightly, his construction worker's hands hanging awkwardly at his sides, as if he didn't know what to do with them. Emily, help us understand what that looks like. Tell us what genuine repentance means to you, what we need to change. It was a fair question, and I appreciated that he was asking rather than assuming he already knew, but the answer was more complicated than a simple list of behavioral modifications or promises to do better in the future. Dad, I said, genuine repentance means acknowledging that your love for me has been conditional from the beginning. It means admitting that you've been trying to shape me into the daughter you wanted, rather than loving the daughter you actually have. It means recognizing that when I didn't fit your expectations, you gradually withdrew your affection and support, until abandoning me felt like the natural next step. The words landed hard because they identified the pattern that had led to this moment. My supposed death hadn't been the first time they'd found it easier to let me go than fight for me. It had just been the most dramatic example of a dynamic that had been building for years. My mother was still crying, but she managed to speak through her tears. Emily, we do love you. We've always loved you, even when we were frustrated with your choices. Mom, I said gently, love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day about how to treat someone, how to prioritize their well-being, how to respond when they need you most. You may have felt love for me, but you didn't choose to love me when it was difficult, or inconvenient, or required you to set aside your own preferences. Mrs. Patterson, still standing in her pew like a moral authority presiding over this family tribunal, nodded approvingly. Emily speaks truth, she said. Love that depends on approval isn't love at all, it's conditional acceptance that can be withdrawn whenever behavior doesn't meet expectations. The validation from someone of Mrs. Patterson's standing in the community carried weight that went beyond personal opinion. She represented the values that my parents claimed to uphold, the Christian principles that should have governed their response to a struggling child. David, who had been standing silently beside Jessica during most of this confrontation, finally spoke up. Emily, I'm trying to understand this from your perspective, but I keep coming back to the practical reality of what happened. Your parents received official notification that you were dead. They were told your body hadn't been recovered because of river conditions. They had to make decisions about funeral arrangements and other obligations while dealing with their grief. Doesn't that explain their actions without requiring us to assume the worst about their motivations? It was a reasonable question from someone who hadn't lived through the years of conditional acceptance that had preceded my accident. David was trying to apply logic to an emotional situation, to find explanations that didn't require him to believe his new family was capable of the kind of abandonment I was describing. David, I said, that might explain the first few days. It might explain making preliminary funeral arrangements while waiting for more information, but it doesn't explain refusing to demand proof of death. It doesn't explain not visiting every hospital in a 100-mile radius to make sure I wasn't lying unconscious somewhere. It doesn't explain scheduling my funeral for the same day as Jessica's wedding, instead of postponing the wedding until they had definitive answers. I paused, looking directly at him. Most importantly, it doesn't explain the relief my mother just admitted to feeling when she thought I was dead. That relief didn't come from grief or confusion or practical necessity, it came from being tired of having a difficult daughter and finding peace in believing the problem had been solved permanently. The harsh truth of that observation settled over the congregation like a judgment they couldn't argue with. My mother's earlier admission had revealed something that went beyond the specific circumstances of my accident into fundamental questions about the nature of parental love and family loyalty. Rachel Martinez stood up again from her seat in the middle of the church. Emily, she said, I've been listening to this conversation, and I keep thinking about something you told me when we worked together. You said that the hardest part about having a family that didn't really accept you was that you kept hoping they would change, kept giving them chances to prove they loved you unconditionally. She paused, looking around the sanctuary at the faces watching our exchange. You said that hope was what kept hurting you, because every time they chose their comfort over your well-being, you had to grieve the family you wished you had, instead of accepting the family you actually had. Rachel's observation cut to the heart of what I'd been struggling with during my recovery. The most painful part of my family's abandonment hadn't been the abandonment itself, but the final death of hope that they might someday love me without conditions or reservations. Rachel's right, I said. I spent years making excuses for your behavior, telling myself that you loved me but just didn't know how to show it. I convinced myself that if I could just be patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, you would eventually recognize my worth and fight for our relationship. I looked at each of my family members in turn, but lying in that hospital bed, asking every day if anyone had called looking for me, finally taught me something I should have learned years ago. You can't love someone into loving you back. You can't hope hard enough to change someone else's priorities. You can't forgive your way into a relationship with people who find your existence inconvenient. The truth was liberating and terrifying at the same time. Accepting that my family was incapable of the kind of love I needed meant letting go of the fantasy that had sustained me through years of disappointment. But it also meant I could stop trying to earn something that was never going to be freely given. Jessica took a step toward me, her wedding dress rustling with the movement. Emily, what you're describing sounds like you've already decided we can't change, that we're incapable of learning to love you better, but people can change. Families can heal. This conversation has shown us things about ourselves that we didn't want to see, but now that we see them, we can work to be different. It was a beautiful sentiment, and I could see the hope in her eyes as she spoke. Jessica genuinely believed that awareness could lead to transformation, that good intentions could overcome patterns established over decades. But I'd heard similar promises before, during previous conflicts and reconciliations that had never led to lasting change. Jessica, I said, change is possible, but it requires more than good intentions and promises to do better. It requires fundamentally shifting your understanding of what family means, what love looks like, what obligations you have to each other. It requires accepting that your comfort and convenience are less important than my well-being and dignity. I walked closer to the altar where she stood, closing the distance between us until we were face to face for the first time since I'd walked through those doors. The question isn't whether you can change. The question is whether you want to change badly enough to do the hard work of examining your values and priorities and rebuilding them from the ground up. Father Brooks had been silent for most of this exchange, but he stepped forward now, with the careful manner of someone trying to provide spiritual guidance in an impossible situation. Emily, forgiveness is one of the most challenging aspects of Christian faith precisely because it asks us to extend grace even when it hasn't been earned. But forgiveness doesn't require you to trust people who haven't proven themselves trustworthy or to subject yourself to further harm from people who haven't demonstrated genuine change. The pastor's words provided a theological framework for what I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Forgiveness and reconciliation weren't the same thing. I could choose to release my anger and resentment without choosing to rebuild relationships with people who hadn't proven they could treat me with basic dignity and respect. Thank you, Father Brooks, I said, that's exactly what I've been trying to understand during my recovery. I can forgive the abandonment without pretending it didn't reveal fundamental truths about how this family operates. I can choose not to carry hatred without choosing to put myself back into a situation where I'll be abandoned again the next time I become inconvenient. My father's face crumpled as the implications of my words sank in. Emily, are you saying you can't forgive us? Are you saying there's no path back to being a family? Dad, I said, I'm saying forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened, it doesn't mean trusting you with my heart again before you've proven you can be trusted with it. It doesn't mean subjecting myself to more conditional love and emotional abandonment because you promised to do better this time. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. I forgive you for giving up on me when I needed you most. I forgive you for finding relief in my supposed death. I forgive you for choosing convenience over hope, celebration over grief, your reputation over my life. I forgive all of it because holding on to that anger was poisoning me more than it was hurting you. The congregation released a collective sigh, as if they'd been holding their breath, waiting for this moment of grace, but I wasn't finished. However, I continued, forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, forgiveness doesn't mean pretending we can pick up where we left off, or that admitting wrongdoing erases the consequences of your choices. Forgiveness means I release you from my anger, but it doesn't mean I trust you with my future. Jessica's face went pale beneath her wedding makeup. Emily, what does that mean? What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm not going to be part of this family anymore, I said, the words feeling both heavy and weightless as they left my mouth. I'm not going to keep hoping for unconditional love from people who have proven they're incapable of providing it. I'm not going to keep subjecting myself to conditional acceptance disguised as family loyalty. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the rustling of fabric and shifting in pews had stopped as everyone processed what I'd just announced. This wasn't the reunion and reconciliation they'd been expecting. This was a divorce, a formal ending of family ties that had been functionally severed years earlier. My mother stood up suddenly, her real estate training finally completely abandoned as raw desperation took over. Emily, no, you can't just walk away from your family. We're your parents. Jessica is your sister. Those bonds don't just disappear because we made mistakes. Mom, I said, those bonds disappeared when you decided I was too much trouble to love consistently. They disappeared when you made your affection conditional on my compliance with your expectations. They disappeared when you chose to let me go rather than fight for me. I looked around the sanctuary, at the faces, watching this final act of our family drama. What I'm doing today isn't walking away from my family. What I'm doing is acknowledging that you walked away from me years ago. I'm just making it official. Tom Bradley, my high school classmate, stood up near the back of the church. Emily, he said, I don't want to interfere in family business, but I've been thinking about something during this conversation. You said earlier that you always fought for people who were written off too easily. Maybe it's time for you to fight for yourself by refusing to be written off anymore. His observation reframed my decision in terms that felt empowering rather than bitter. I wasn't abandoning my family out of spite or anger. I was finally valuing myself enough to refuse relationships that required me to accept less than basic respect and dignity. Tom's right, I said. For years, I've been fighting to be included in a family that didn't really want me. I've been trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. Today, I'm choosing to fight for myself instead by refusing to accept conditional love disguised as family obligation. Foster stood up in the back of the church, her medical authority lending weight to her words. Emily, she said, during your recovery, you talked often about the difference between healing and recovery. Healing happens to your body, whether you participate or not. Recovery is an active choice to rebuild your life in healthier ways. What you're describing sounds like recovery. The distinction was important because it positioned my decision as a healthy choice rather than a bitter reaction. I wasn't running away from my family out of anger. I was choosing to build a life that didn't depend on their approval or acceptance for my sense of worth and belonging. Jessica was crying again, but these tears looked different from her earlier displays of emotion. These seemed like tears of genuine loss rather than frustrated self-pity. Emily, if you leave us now, if you cut ties completely, how do we ever get the chance to prove we can change? How do we ever rebuild what we've broken? It was a fair question, and I could see the genuine pain in her eyes as she asked it, but the burden of proof couldn't fall on me anymore. I'd spent years giving them chances to prove they could love me without conditions. I'd forgiven previous betrayals and accepted previous apologies. At some point, the responsibility had to shift to them to demonstrate change without requiring me to subject myself to further potential harm. Jessica, I said, if you genuinely want to change, you'll change, whether I'm watching or not. If you truly want to learn to love without conditions, you'll do that work for your own growth, not to win me back. If you really want to become the kind of family that fights for each other, you'll demonstrate that in how you treat each other and other people who become vulnerable to you. I paused, looking at her directly, and if you ever truly become those people, if you ever genuinely transform into a family capable of unconditional love and fierce loyalty, then maybe someday we can have a conversation about whether reconciliation is possible, but that conversation can't happen until you've proven you can maintain that transformation without me as an audience. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly from her pew. Wisdom, she said simply, true repentance proves itself through changed behavior over time, not through promises made in moments of crisis. My father took another step toward me, his face showing
the kind of raw pain that comes from recognizing a loss that can't be undone. Emily, sweetheart, what if we do change? What if we really do the work and become better people? How will you know? How will we find you to show you who we've become? Dad, I said, if you genuinely change, if you really become the kind of people who fight for family members instead of abandoning them, the whole community will know. Millbrook isn't that big. Word travels. People will see how you treat Jessica when she disappoints you, how you handle conflict with friends and neighbors, how you respond when someone you care about becomes inconvenient. I looked around the sanctuary at the faces that had witnessed this entire confrontation. These people will be watching to see if today was a moment of accountability that led to genuine transformation or just another crisis you managed until things went back to normal. If you really change, they'll see it. And if they see it consistently over years, not months, then maybe someone will mention it to someone who knows someone who can get word to me. The plan was vague by design. I wasn't creating a clear path back to me because I didn't want them changing their behavior as a performance designed to win me back. If they were going to transform, it needed to be for its own sake, because they recognized the fundamental problems with how they'd been living and relating to people. David had been listening quietly, but he spoke up now with the careful tone of someone trying to understand complex dynamics he hadn't previously considered. Emily, I hear what you're saying about needing them to prove change over time, but cutting contact completely seems extreme. Couldn't there be some middle ground, some way to maintain minimal contact while they work on themselves? David, I said, I appreciate that you're trying to find a compromise solution, but compromise is what got us here in the first place. I compromised my need for unconditional love by accepting conditional acceptance. I compromised my requirement for family loyalty by understanding their frustration with my choices. I compromised my expectation of being fought for by accepting their exhaustion with conflict. I shook my head. Middle ground only works when both parties are operating from good faith. My family has proven they prioritize their comfort over my well-being. Any continued contact would just give them opportunities to manage and manipulate the situation without doing the hard work of genuine change. Rachel stood up again, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had worked with me closely and understood my decision-making process. Emily's right, she said. She's spent years trying to find middle ground with people who kept moving the boundaries. At some point, protecting yourself requires clear boundaries that can't be negotiated or compromised. The support from community members who had watched this family dynamic play out over years was validating in ways I hadn't expected. These people had seen the pattern of my family's behavior, had witnessed the gradual erosion of my place in the Carter family structure. Their testimony carried weight because it wasn't contaminated by family dynamics or personal emotional investment. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had spoken earlier about losing her own son, stood up slowly with her husband's help. Emily, she said, I've been thinking about something during this conversation. When my Tommy died, the grief nearly killed me. But it was honest grief for a real loss. What your parents experienced wasn't grief at all. It was relief disguised as mourning. That's not something that gets fixed with apologies and promises to do better. The observation from someone who had experienced genuine loss provided context that my family couldn't argue with. Mrs. Henderson understood the difference between fighting desperately against loss and accepting loss as a convenience. Her testimony highlighted just how far my parents had fallen short of basic parental instincts. I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me as I listened to the community validate my decision. For years I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive, too demanding, too unwilling to accept normal family imperfections. But hearing these neighbors and friends articulate what they'd witnessed confirmed that my family's behavior had been outside the bounds of normal dysfunction. Mrs. Henderson, I said, thank you for that perspective. You're right that what they experienced wasn't grief. And I think that's exactly why reconciliation isn't possible right now. You can't rebuild a relationship with people who were relieved when they thought you were dead. You can't trust your heart to people who found peace in your absence. My mother had been crying quietly throughout this exchange, but she suddenly stood up with a look of desperate determination. Emily, please don't do this. Please don't cut us out of your life completely. We can change. We will change. Just give us the chance to prove it to you. Mom, I said, you've had 28 years to prove you could love me unconditionally. You've had countless opportunities to choose my well-being over your comfort, my happiness over your reputation, my needs over your convenience. The time for chances has passed. I paused, feeling the finality of what I was about to say, but more than that, asking me to give you another chance proves you still don't understand what you did wrong. You're still making this about your need for forgiveness rather than my need for protection. You're still prioritizing your emotional comfort over my psychological safety." Father Brooks stepped forward one more time, his pastoral instincts struggling against the reality of what he was witnessing. "Emily, I understand your need to protect yourself, but complete estrangement seems like a form of spiritual death for everyone involved. Families are meant to be the place where we learn forgiveness and redemption, where we practice grace even when it's difficult." "Father Brooks," I said, "families are also meant to be places of safety and unconditional love. When families become sources of harm rather than healing, when they teach conditional acceptance rather than grace, then stepping away from them can be an act of spiritual self-preservation." I looked around the sanctuary one more time, taking in the faces of people who had known me since childhood, who had watched me grow up in this church, who had witnessed both my family's public image and their private dysfunction. "I want to thank everyone here for witnessing this conversation," I said. "For years the Carter family's dysfunction happened behind closed doors, hidden behind public respectability and private justifications. Today you've seen the truth about what conditional love looks like, about what happens when families choose convenience over loyalty." I turned back to my family members standing in their formal clothes in the church where they'd expected to celebrate Jessica's second wedding, and instead had experienced a reckoning they never saw coming. "I forgive you," I said simply. "I release you from my anger and resentment because carrying those emotions was hurting me more than it was affecting you. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, and releasing anger doesn't mean accepting future harm." Jessica took a step toward me, her hand extended as if she could physically bridge the gap that was opening between us. "Emily, please. I love you. We all love you. Doesn't that count for anything?" "Jessica," I said, "love isn't what you feel. Love is what you do. Love is how you treat people when it's difficult and inconvenient. Love is fighting for someone when they need you most, not giving up on them when they become problematic." I stepped back, creating physical distance that matched the emotional boundary I was establishing. "You may feel affection for me, but you don't know how to love me in ways that make me feel valued and secure, and I can't keep teaching you how to love me while subjecting myself to your practice attempts." The finality in my voice seemed to penetrate in ways that my earlier explanations hadn't. I could see my family members processing the reality that this wasn't a negotiation or a moment of crisis that could be managed and moved past. This was an ending, a formal conclusion to relationships that had been dying for years. I walked back toward the sanctuary doors, my footsteps echoing in the silence that had settled over the congregation. But before I reached the exit, I turned back one final time. "To everyone who attended my memorial service and then celebrated Jessica's wedding on the same day," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the church acoustics, "you now know what that day really represented. You witnessed a family that found convenience more compelling than hope, celebration more important than grief, moving on more appealing than fighting for someone they claimed to love." I paused, looking directly at my parents. "I hope that knowledge influences how you think about family loyalty, about the obligations we have to fight for each other, about what unconditional love actually looks like in practice." With that, I turned and walked through the sanctuary doors for the second time that day. But this time, I wasn't the ghost returning to haunt my family's choices. This time, I was a woman walking away from people who had proven they didn't deserve access to her heart. The afternoon sun was warm on my face as I stepped outside St. Andrew's Methodist Church, no longer burdened by the weight of hoping for love that would never come freely given. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices as 300 wedding guests processed what they'd witnessed, as my family tried to figure out how to move forward from a confrontation that had exposed truths they'd spent years hiding. But their recovery wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had forgiven them and freed myself from the anger that had been poisoning my healing process. Now I could focus on building a life that didn't depend on their approval, creating relationships with people who were capable of the kind of loyalty and unconditional love I deserved. As I drove away from Millbrook that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete freedom from the hope that had been hurting me more than the rejection itself. I was finally free to love and be loved without conditions, to build family bonds based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation and convenience. The Carter family name would continue without me, but I would thrive without them. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away, when to stop fighting for people who will never fight back, when to choose your own well-being over other people's comfort. I had walked into that church to show them the consequences of their abandonment. I walked out having freed myself from the burden of their love, ready to discover what life looked like when you stopped trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided you weren't worth the effort. The wedding they'd planned for that day was over before it began, but my new life was just getting started. 6 months after walking out of St. Andrew's Methodist Church, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, watching rain streak down the windows while I worked on a freelance design project for a nonprofit that helped reunite foster children with stable families. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now helping other people find the kind of family bonds I'd given up hope of having myself, but there was something deeply satisfying about using my skills to create materials that might help vulnerable children find homes where they would be genuinely wanted. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Webb, the paramedic who had become my closest friend since leaving Millbrook. Marcus had been the one person from my past who reached out after word of the church confrontation spread through social media and local gossip networks. He'd driven to Portland 3 weeks after the incident, found my apartment, and simply asked if I needed anything. No judgment, no attempts to broker peace with my family, no suggestions that I should forgive and forget for the sake of keeping the peace. "Coffee this afternoon," his message read. "I have news about Millbrook you might want to hear." I hesitated before responding. Part of me had deliberately avoided any information about my family or former hometown, wanting to create clean space for building a new life without the constant pull of old drama. But Marcus had proven himself trustworthy with information, sharing only what seemed genuinely relevant to my well-being, rather than feeding me gossip for entertainment value. "Neutral news or gossip?" I typed back. "Neutral news that affects the whole community. Your call if you want details." 20 minutes later, we were sitting across from each other in a corner booth at the coffee shop, Marcus still wearing his paramedic uniform after finishing a shift at Portland General Hospital. He'd transferred from Millbrook's small emergency services department 2 months after my confrontation, citing a need for more challenging work in a larger city. But I suspected he'd also grown uncomfortable with the way the community had started treating him differently once they learned about his friendship with me. "So," I said, stirring cream into my coffee, "what's happening in Millbrook that rises to the level of neutral news?" Marcus leaned back in his seat, choosing his words carefully. "Your parents sold the house. They're moving to Linda's sister's place in Eugene. Robert's closing down the construction business, selling the equipment and client list to Tom Bradley's company." The information hit me with unexpected force. I'd assumed that life in Millbrook would continue essentially unchanged after my departure, that my family would weather the social consequences of our public confrontation and eventually return to their normal routines. The idea that they were abandoning the life they'd built there suggested the aftermath had been more difficult than I'd anticipated. "When did this happen?" I asked. "The house went on the market 3 weeks ago. Sold in 5 days, which tells you something about how eager they were to leave. Tom told me Robert looked like he'd aged 10 years when he came in to discuss the business transfer." Marcus paused, studying my face for reactions. "Emily, I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty or to suggest you should reach out to them. I just thought you should know that your decision to walk away had consequences beyond what happened in the church that day." I appreciated his directness.
Marcus had been the one person who understood that my choice to sever ties with my family had been about self-preservation rather than punishment, about protecting my own well-being rather than seeking revenge. He'd never tried to convince me to reconsider or suggested that family reconciliation should be my ultimate goal. Do you know what prompted the move? I asked. From what I've heard, the social consequences were pretty severe. Linda lost several real estate clients who said they couldn't trust someone who'd abandoned their own daughter. Robert's business started losing contracts when word spread about what happened at the church. Jessica and David moved to Salem about a month ago. Marcus took a sip of his coffee before continuing, but I think the bigger issue was that they couldn't live with themselves in a place where everyone knew what they'd done. Mrs. Patterson has been pretty vocal about what she witnessed, and her opinion carries a lot of weight in that community. The idea that my family had become social pariahs in Millbrook created a complex mix of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Part of me felt vindicated that the community had held them accountable for their choices. Part of me felt sad that people I'd grown up with were experiencing the kind of isolation I'd lived with for years. And part of me wondered if the social consequences had taught them anything about the impact of their behavior or if they simply resented being judged for choices they still believed were justified. Marcus, I said, do you think they learned anything from what happened, or do you think they just feel like victims of unfair judgment? He considered the question seriously, as he always did when I asked for his perspective on complex emotional situations. I think it's probably both. From what I've observed, people who've never had to examine their own behavior deeply tend to experience accountability as persecution, at least initially. Whether they move past that into genuine self-reflection depends on factors I can't assess from the outside. It was a fair assessment that avoided the temptation to either demonize my family or excuse their behavior. Marcus had a gift for seeing human complexity without losing sight of moral clarity, a skill that probably served him well in emergency medical work where he had to treat people regardless of the circumstances that had led to their injuries. There's something else, Marcus said, his tone shifting slightly. Rachel Martinez asked me to pass along a message if I thought you'd want to hear it. I nodded for him to continue. She said to tell you that the Golden Second Chance project you talked about starting has actually happened. Mrs. Patterson and some other community members have created a support group for elderly people dealing with family conflicts and financial exploitation. They're calling it the Emily Carter Foundation. The news that my name was being used for a community service project created another layer of complicated emotions. It was touching that people who'd witnessed my family's abandonment had been inspired to help others in similar situations, but it was also strange to have my personal trauma transformed into a public cause, to know that my story was being used as an example of what could happen when families failed their most vulnerable members. How do you feel about that? Marcus asked, clearly reading the conflict on my face. I'm honored that something positive came out of what happened, I said slowly, but it's also weird to have my family drama turned into a community foundation. I don't know if I'm comfortable being the poster child for family estrangement, even if it's helping other people. Marcus nodded, understanding. Rachel said to tell you that they're not using your story specifically, just the principles you talked about regarding unconditional support and fighting for people who've been written off. But she wanted you to know in case you ever heard about it through other channels. The distinction mattered. I could support the idea of helping elderly people who were being exploited or abandoned by their families without wanting my personal experience to be the public face of that cause. My story belonged to me, and I needed to maintain control over how it was shared and used. Did Rachel say anything else? I asked. She said to tell you that if you ever want to come back and see what they've built, you'd be welcome. But she also said she understands if Millbrook feels too complicated to revisit, even for good reasons. The invitation was thoughtful but not something I was ready to consider. Millbrook would always be the place where I'd learned that my family's love was conditional, where I'd been abandoned in my darkest hour, where I'd finally chosen my own well-being over other people's comfort. Returning there, even for positive reasons, would require emotional preparation I wasn't sure I wanted to undertake. Tell Rachel I appreciate the invitation and the work they're doing, I said, but I'm not ready to go back there yet, maybe someday but not now. Marcus finished his coffee and checked his watch. I need to get going, but there's one more thing I want to mention. I know you've been careful about avoiding information about your family, but I thought you should know that David reached out to me a few weeks ago. I felt my stomach tighten. David was the family member I'd had the least conflict with, the one who'd seemed most genuinely confused by the dynamics he'd witnessed at the church. If he was reaching out through Marcus, it suggested he had something to say that he thought I might actually want to hear. What did he want? I asked. He wanted me to know that he and Jessica are in marriage counseling, working specifically on understanding how conditional love affects relationships. He said watching what happened with your family made him realize he didn't want to repeat those patterns with Jessica or any future children they might have. Marcus paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. He also wanted me to tell you that he's sorry for not understanding the situation better when you confronted them at the church. He said he's been doing a lot of reading about family dynamics and trauma, and he now understands that what your parents did wasn't just a mistake made during grief. It was the culmination of years of conditional acceptance. The message from David was unexpected and strangely comforting. It suggested that at least one member of my extended family had been capable of learning and growth, that the confrontation at the church had prompted genuine self-reflection rather than just defensive rationalization. Did he ask you to encourage me to reach out to them? I asked. No, actually he specifically said he wasn't asking for any response or contact. He just wanted you to know that your decision to walk away had forced him to examine his own capacity for unconditional love, and he was grateful for that even though he was sorry about the circumstances that made it necessary. The distinction was important. David wasn't trying to manipulate me into reconciliation or using his growth as a bargaining chip for renewed contact. He was simply acknowledging that my choice to protect myself had inadvertently benefited his own relationship by forcing him to confront patterns he might never have examined otherwise. I appreciate him sharing that, I said, and I'm glad he and Jessica are working on building healthier patterns. But it doesn't change my decision about maintaining distance from the family. Marcus nodded. He said he understood that and respected your boundaries. He just wanted you to know that your courage in walking away had positive ripple effects beyond what you might realize. After Marcus left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour processing the information he'd shared. The news that my family had essentially fled Millbrook suggested that the social consequences of their behavior had been more severe than I'd anticipated. The fact that community members had created a foundation inspired by my situation suggested that my story had resonated with people who'd witnessed similar dynamics in their own families or communities. But most significantly, the message from David suggested that at least one person had been genuinely changed by witnessing our family's dysfunction, that the painful public confrontation had served a purpose beyond my own need for validation and closure. Over the following weeks I found myself thinking often about the concept of unintended consequences. I'd walked into that church to show my family the cost of their abandonment, to force them to confront the reality of their choices in front of the community that had enabled their behavior through willful ignorance. I'd achieved those goals, but I hadn't anticipated the broader ripple effects of that confrontation. My family's exodus from Millbrook had apparently created space for more honest conversations about family loyalty and conditional love. The foundation created in my name was helping elderly people who might otherwise suffer in silence when their families failed them. David and Jessica's marriage was apparently being strengthened by their willingness to examine and change dysfunctional patterns they might never have recognized otherwise. These positive outcomes didn't vindicate my family's behavior or make their abandonment acceptable. But they did suggest that sometimes the most difficult choices, the ones that feel selfish or harsh in the moment, can create space for growth and healing that wouldn't have been possible if we'd continued enabling destructive patterns through our silence and acceptance. 3 months later, I received an unexpected package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check for $5,000 made out to the Emily Carter Foundation. The letter was from Mrs. Patterson. Dear Emily, it read in her careful handwriting, I wanted you to know that the foundation we created in your honor has helped 12 families in its first 6 months of operation. We've provided legal assistance for elderly people being financially exploited by relatives, emotional support for seniors who've been abandoned by their children, and advocacy for those who need someone to fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. The letter continued, your courage in confronting your family publicly gave permission for other people to speak honestly about their own experiences with conditional love and family abandonment. We've discovered that your situation was far from unique, that many families in our community have been struggling with similar dynamics behind closed doors. Mrs. Patterson went on to explain that the check was from an anonymous donor who'd been inspired by my story to support the foundation's work. They asked me to tell you that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal is painful for everyone involved. The letter concluded with an invitation I hadn't expected. Emily, I know you're not ready to return to Millbrook, and I respect that decision completely, but I want you to know that when and if you ever choose to visit, you'll find a community that has learned important lessons from watching your family's choices and your response to them. You'll find people who understand the difference between forgiveness and enabling, between family loyalty and conditional acceptance. Reading Mrs. Patterson's letter, I realized that my decision to walk away from my family had been transformed into something larger than personal self-protection. It had become a catalyst for community conversations about values and relationships that might never have happened otherwise. But more importantly, I realized that I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. The life I'd built in Portland was small but authentic, filled with work that felt meaningful and relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. I'd discovered that chosen family could be more nurturing than biological family, that love given freely was infinitely more satisfying than love extracted through guilt or manipulation. 6 months after walking out of St. Andrew's Methodist Church, I was no longer the daughter who'd spent years trying to earn unconditional love from people incapable of giving it. I was a woman who'd learned to value herself enough to refuse relationships that required her to accept less than basic dignity and respect. The Carter family name would continue without me, but I was thriving without them. I'd chosen my own well-being over their comfort, my own truth over their narrative, my own future over their past. And for the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely proud of the choices I'd made and the person I was becoming. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes pain for people you care about. Sometimes protecting yourself creates space for others to grow in ways that wouldn't have been possible if you'd continued accepting unacceptable treatment. I'd walked into that church to show my family the consequences of their abandonment. I'd walked out having freed myself from the burden of their conditional love. And in the months that followed, I'd discovered that freedom was just the beginning of learning how to live authentically, how to love without conditions, and how to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The wedding they'd planned for that day had ended before it began, but my new life was flourishing in ways I'd never imagined possible when I was still trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth the effort. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.